Hello, Civics. How are you all on this Monday? So, rapidly, we are finishing the president. I know this is going to go on fast and furious in a sense, but we got a lot of stuff to cover by May here, so we're going to do this quick. And then it's the judicial branch this week, and then probably Monday of next week, expected president and judicial branch test on Infinite Campus. So, all right, so we're going to look at what really how's the executive branch organized. This is a huge bureaucracy. It's a thing to understand. This employs, almost over 1 million people work for the federal government. The vast majority of them here in the executive branch. As I said, it's a huge bureaucracy, which is an organization of government departments, agencies, organizations, etc. There are three parts to the executive branch. There's the office of the president. These are people in the White House who work directly for the president. There's your executive departments, your Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Treasury, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education, Transportation, etc. And then you got your independent agencies like NASA is a good example of, or the Environmental Protection Agency. They don't fall under any one executive department, but their own independent branches. So, and again, in the executive office of president, these are people who choose to help the president to make his policies, both foreign and domestic. They advise the president, but they don't carry out laws and stuff. So as Congress passes a law, or how to get laws maybe the president wants passed, or how to carry out policies, like right now, and sort of these are the people like now currently who often work in the White House. They work often. They advise President Trump on many issues. Every president, they have people who work directly at the White House for them and their staff. And these are the people usually the president will trust the most. So, national security, economy, and others. All of these. And the president basically makes a determination of how big this is. How does he want to do? What does he want to do? What are his goals? And what things does he want to get accomplished in this? That will determine the size of the White House staff. What about the vice president? Under the U.S. Constitution, the vice president has no duties, but basically the vice president really comes up, what the vice president does is really what the president wants him to do. We've had some presidents who basically have told the vice president to kind of go lay by your dish, don't bother me, and we've had vice presidents who have been very more integral part of helping the president. And as the world has sort of become more complicated, as the United States became a much larger role in the world and world affairs, you've seen the vice president take on a much more active role in the government. Like right now, Vice President Pence is part of heading the task force and helping the government deal with the coronavirus right now as well. So it depends. But again, we don't know, and that all depends on the president. Again, so far, 9 times in our history, the vice president has become president. And again, and sometimes they're not really in the loop that much. Like when 1945, when President Roosevelt died, Truman, the vice president, who now became president, had only met the president twice in the 3 months that before FDR died when he took over for his fourth term. But Truman didn't even know about the atomic bomb. And now suddenly when President Truman became president, he suddenly had to make the decision how to use the thing as well. So it's an example depending on what happened. Well, how active is the vice president? It depends a lot on the president. Special advisory groups. So these are groups that help make the decision. The Office of OMB, government acronyms, Office of Management and Budget. So if the president wants to do this, like, hey, I want NASA to send astronauts to Mars. They these are the guys that come up and say, well, this is probably what it's going to cost approximately, because there's always things they can never figure out. Or I want the Navy to have more ships. How much is that's these are the people who will come up with all of that ideas. If I want to set up broadband internet to everybody across the country, including rural areas, how much is that going to cost? These are the people that'll do it. And then National Security Council. So if there's ever a foreign crisis, these top military officers and advisors on foreign policy. When there's a crisis, they get together and they advise the president, and, hey, this is what you need to do. This is what will happen, or these are our options and stuff whatsoever. These are, a lot of the critical decisions can be made here or advice to the president. Sometimes they don't always, the president doesn't have to follow their advice. Ultimately, it's the president's decision. They can give the advice that they want and they think it's the best, but ultimately the president makes the decision. Sometimes these councils can put a lot of pressure on a president to maybe make a decision that maybe the council thinks is the best one, and maybe it's not as well. It depends. These are all, again, very powerful groups, and all can be very complicated and very tough decisions that a president has to make. Executive departments. So these are the 15 branches in the largest part, and each fulfills part of the president's duty. For instance, Department of State, Department of Defense. Department of Defense used to be actually called the War Department, but that was changed after World War II when the creation of the Air Force and the military was completely reorganized in 1947 and created the Department of Defense. Department of State is one of the oldest, the original, as well as the Department of Treasury, along with the Department of, the War Department as well. And here's a good breakdown of, our Constitution, the executive branch, and then the different executive departments. I don't think Homeland Security is on this. This is going to be a little dated in a sense as well. So that's the newest one, created in the wake of after 9/11 and stuff as well. So, but you can see is on every one of these is headed by, a cabinet member of the cabinet, the president's cabinet, and they're actually all in line for. In the event of the United States is attacked, of all the president, vice president, speaker of the House, they're all in line to become. It would take a whole lot for eventually the Department of Veterans Affairs to become, like the president and stuff. But that's part of the chain of command. And again, the Department of Homeland Security is the newest, created after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and they form, each one of these secretaries forms the cabinet, the leaders from each department to form a special group of advisors. What about independent agencies? They cover areas not in the executive departments, which fall into 3 categories. Excuse me. Executive agencies, regulatory commissions, and government corporations. So no, you won't have to know all of them. We're just going to kind of cover a few of the more important ones. But you want to Google executive branch and knock yourself out. Maybe if you're getting kind of a little bored quarantine, you'll knock yourself out. You'll be shocked at how big and how much it is there isn't in the federal government. So these are under the direct control of the president. Again, the most notable are like NASA and the Environmental Protection Agency are 2 of the most notable executive agencies. Each one was created basically to deal with a specific issue. Of course, NASA was created with the space race in the late 1950s during Cold War, and the Environmental Protection Agency was created in the late 20th century to help deal with growing environmental pollution by many corporations and companies across the country. Regulatory commissions, there are 12 of them, and they make and enforce the rules for specific business or economic activity. Probably the most famous one is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They make the rules for radio and TV. In other words, what words can or cannot be said on TV, including like swear words and vulgar words that are vulgar. Stations could get fined or as well, and of course. Also with net neutrality, this was an issue a couple years ago about the idea that the internet should be open and equal. The FCC ruled on it again, basically dismantling it, believing that corporations' business could bring better speed to the public than the whole idea of government mandated net neutrality to regulate the internet as well. So. What about government corporations? They provide a public service too risky or expensive for private business. The most famous one is the United States Postal Service, which has been in the news recently as well. The thought about the Postal Service is running out of money, maybe possibly lose money by the end of the summer as well. So it's a good example of a government corporation. Another one's the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you go to the bank, you'll probably see this FDIC thing. So basically what this is insurance for banks. So if you have, your bank accounts are insured up to $250,000. So if for some reason that bank collapses, it goes out of business, and you had money in that bank, you will get at least up to $250,000. If you have $251,000 in the bank, you get $250. You're out $1,000. So this was created in the wake of the Great Depression, where basically many banks had invested heavily. They had taken people's deposits, invested heavily in the stock markets, and since they lost heavily in the stock markets, when people came to get their money and the banks didn't have them, and so suddenly the banks folded, and a lot of people lost all their money for doing not doing anything wrong. They thought they were doing the right thing by putting their money in the bank to save it for some quote like a rainy day, as the saying used to be. Excuse me again. My voice gets a little dry here. So the Constitution requires the president to present the Congress information on the State of the Union. And the State of the Union is the president's formal speech to Congress. So, which is done every year. And it's usually a big thing. It's usually on TV, hour or so. On this, the president lays out what they want to get done. Hey, these are my goals. This is what I want to do this year, etc. So, and a lot of times there's a lot of clapping, a lot of backslapping, applauding, or sometimes not applauding either, depending on, usually the opposing party won't, if they don't agree with something, it's how they make their way of disapproval is they don't do anything. They just sit there and stuff, in response to things that the president says. What are the limits? The president can only veto an entire law. He cannot line out parts of it. It's either all or nothing. So that's the thing the president must do. So when he gets these huge bills like in a budget, which is thousands of pages long, if he doesn't like this one thing, he has to veto the entire law. So there's been some presidents who asked for a line item veto, but it would take an amendment in Congress. I don't see that ever happening. War Powers Act. So this was passed by Congress in the wake of the Vietnam War to try to restrain the president's ability to use troops. It was actually vetoed by President Nixon, and actually Congress overrode the veto, which says troops must not remain for more than 60 days without congressional approval. So it's never been used to rein in the president's use of troops, so some have questioned what it is, but the president has gotten approval by Congress for use of military force basically ever since. From the first Gulf War, invasion of Panama in 1989, including use, Kosovo in 1985, as well as obviously Iraq and Afghanistan, and the invasion, combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, all were authorized by the Congress. The 20th Amendment fixes the date of the president's term, which all starts on January 20th. And at noon, and the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms, passed after, of course, President Roosevelt's election, 4-term election and stuff as well. And lastly, the other limit is, of course, the 25th Amendment, which determines presidential succession in case of death or incapacitation. There have been several cases in American history where the president, like President Woodrow Wilson in 1919, had a stroke and basically was bedridden for like 6 months. He was bedridden. So nobody really running the country. President Eisenhower had a heart attack, so in the 1950s. And so all of these things, what do we do if was felt that we need to spell this out in case the president has, died or incapacitated, what happens to him and stuff as well. In 1981, when President Reagan was shot and was taken into emergency surgery, they used the 25th Amendment again to obviously allow then Vice President George Bush to take over in the president's duties until President Reagan was released from the hospital. So there's short and sweet, the kind of organization of the executive branch. It's fast and it's quick. Plan on getting a study guide probably Thursday and or maybe Friday, seeing how we get, depending on what we get through the judicial branch. Again, it's going to come pretty quick here. We'll kind of focus mainly on the Supreme Court and the organization of federal courts, a little bit about state courts. A lot of stuff to come this week, as it's just how it is. I'm running out of time here as we're kind of getting through May, so I want to try to make sure we cover our main points as best we can. So in addition to this slideshow, you will see kind of a definition of terms for the judicial branch, and those terms will be due for tomorrow. Have a good day.